There was a moment when our childhood disappeared, and most of us didn't even notice. It happened the day Toys R Us fell. For decades, Toys R Us wasn't just a store. It was an immersive experience designed to capture the imaginations of children everywhere. It was a place every kid would beg their parents to go to, where aisles felt endless, colors felt more vibrant, and every visit was like an adventure into a more fun world. But behind the scenes was a business fighting battles that most customers never saw. Between competitors closing in, the world of retail changing faster than anyone could have predicted, and a series of bad decisions, the toy store giant we all knew and loved was pushed to the edge and eventually collapsed. But the fall of Toys R Us wasn't because kids suddenly stopped wanting toys. It was because the world around it was changing, and the company didn't change with it. This is the story of how Toys R Us was able to rise and become a toy store empire, and the decisions made that eventually caused it to all come crashing down. Before Toys R Us became a staple of childhood for millions around the world, it started with an entrepreneur named Charles Lazarus, who in 1948, after returning from World War II, realized something that many at the time didn't. People were about to start having a lot of babies, and this new baby boom period would be the perfect time to capitalize. So he decided to open a shop selling children's furniture. After a while, he also started selling a few toys in his furniture shop, and that was when he noticed a pattern he didn't expect. Parents weren't coming back to his shop for more cribs. They were coming back for more toys. This insight led to a bold decision: to build a store dedicated entirely to toys. So in 1957, he opened the first Toys R Us, a huge warehouse-sized supermarket that sold toys decades before superstores became normalized. The store Lazarus opened was colorful, vibrant, fun, and unlike anything families were used to. And this store became an instant success. So throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Toys R Us expanded across cities, states, and even countries, and at its peak had opened close to 1,600 stores worldwide. Toys R Us wasn't just successful, it was completely dominant, and when Lazarus eventually decided to step down as CEO in 1994, he had done what he had set out to do, which was turn his toy store into a global powerhouse. At its peak, Toys R Us generated over $13 billion in annual revenue, and was without a doubt the biggest toy retailer on the planet. The brand was a cultural icon that nearly everyone in the US recognized instantly, including the fan favorite Toys R Us brand mascot, Geoffrey the Giraffe. For millions of us, Toys R Us was more than just a toy store. It was a place filled with memories and adventures of exploring the colorful aisles of cool new toys and harassing your parents to buy you something new on a Saturday afternoon. But while Toys R Us was perfect for the world it started in, the world was about to begin changing rapidly, and this would be the beginning of the end for the toy store empire. While Toys R Us was still celebrating its continued dominance, the retail world was silently starting to shift under its feet. The first vulnerability that was beginning to get exposed was the business model itself. Toys R Us was successful because it was built on specialization. It sold toys better than everyone else, but while that specialization is what allowed them to dominate for decades, it was about to become a major weakness. Because by the late 90s, major retailers were beginning to catch on. Stores like Walmart, Target, and Costco all started to add a toy aisle to their stores in an effort to undercut Toys R Us on price. And they were able to do this effectively. They realized that they didn't even need to make a profit on toys, they just needed to price them low so that they could draw in families that would normally shop for toys at Toys R Us, and then they would be able to make up the difference and more with everything else in the store. Toys R Us would have no way to effectively combat this strategy, as they were built to sell toys and only toys. And while low prices from these competitors would begin to eat away at profits, the aesthetic of Toys R Us was also starting to feel outdated. The bright and colorful aisles that made the store feel magical in the 80s and 90s were now making it seem old, especially in comparison to the modernized styles competitors like Walmart and Target were now adopting for their stores. All of the advantages that Toys R Us had previously had to rely on were now becoming weaknesses as the world began to evolve. And inside the company, for the first time, executives were beginning to feel some pressure as sales and traffic began to dip, and market share began shrinking. All the data showed that it was time for Toys R Us to begin reinventing itself, but instead of truly modernizing the brand for a changing world, the toy store would make a decision that would push it even closer to its eventual collapse. By the late 1990s, the internet was starting to change the way people shopped, and Toys R Us executives knew they needed to begin moving online. But the problem was they didn't have the infrastructure or logistics to suddenly become a giant in the online market. So they made a decision that seemed logical at the time, but would end up being a core reason for their downfall. They partnered with Amazon. In 2000, they would sign a 10-year exclusive deal that would make Toys R Us the official toy store on Amazon's website. Amazon would handle all of the infrastructure and logistics, and all Toys R Us would have to do is supply the products. This deal seemed like a no-brainer at the time, as it instantly gave Toys R Us access to millions of customers that primarily shopped online. But the decision was short-sighted, as the deal meant Toys R Us would be essentially handing over its entire online future to Amazon. And then Amazon eventually violated the exclusivity agreement by allowing other toy suppliers to sell products on their platform. This would lead to a legal battle that Toys R Us would win, but the damage was already done, because Amazon was now the default place that online shoppers went to buy toys, and Toys R Us was now left with no online presence. The biggest toy retailer in the world had made the mistake of outsourcing its online future to the company that would absolutely dominate the space. By the mid-2000s, Toys R Us was still a dominant force in the toy industry, but behind the scenes, the company was truly starting to struggle due to the rise of competition both online and on the ground. Then, in 2005, private equity firms Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado bought Toys R Us in a $6.6 billion leveraged buyout. This deal would prove to be the beginning of the end for the toy giant, as it would leave the company with over $5 billion in debt, and the interest payments alone would cost the company hundreds of millions of dollars annually. This limited the company's ability to reinvest into modernization and developing e-commerce, as they would now be spending all of that money on interest. Then, by the mid-2010s, the company was visibly falling apart. The debt was suffocating, the stores were becoming increasingly outdated, and competitors were moving at a pace Toys R Us could no longer keep up with due to the debt. Finally, by 2017, Toys R Us would officially file for bankruptcy. And to make matters worse, a lackluster 2017 holiday season would force the company to close all of its US stores by 2018. This was truly a sad moment in time, as millions of employees were forced to pack up shelves and would soon need a new job. And parents that grew up with the store walked through the aisles with their kids one final time as a piece of their childhood disappeared forever. And just like that, the most iconic toy store of all time would be closing its doors for good. In the end, Toys R Us fell for a multitude of reasons. It fell because strong retail competitors like Walmart and Target realized they were able to use toys to draw in families and undercut Toys R Us on price by selling other items while they were solely reliant on toys. It fell because Toys R Us would make a devastating decision by handing over its online future to Amazon, who would eventually betray them and leave them with no online presence. And then they were truly buried once they were bought out by private equity firms and left with a pile of debt that they would never be able to recover from. This story shows that deals that may seem great for business at the time can eventually lead to catastrophic effects in the long term, and this should always be considered before making a deal. It also shows that as times change, businesses that were dominant in one era may not be able to survive in another as business models become outdated. And had Toys R Us made some different moves and attempted to modernize at a faster pace, maybe they would still be here today. But unfortunately, they were unable to do this and are now a memory of the past. But for the millions of kids who grew up going to Toys R Us, it's a place that always evokes fond memories and nostalgia in a way that shopping on Amazon never will. And for a brand built for a different time, that's a win in and of itself. So between that and the billions of dollars the toy store was able to generate over the span of decades, I think the late Charles Lazarus can rest proud knowing his toy store venture was an overall success. This was the Visionary Analyst. If you enjoyed this video, please help the channel grow by subscribing, dropping a like on the video, and following me on my other social media accounts linked in the description. And get ready for the next video, where we'll be taking a look at a business success, with the story of how KFC was able to dominate in the Chinese market.